Hey there, where are you watching from? Drop your city in the comments.
My mother stood at the head of the patio table, her posture perfect, eyes sparkling with the kind of satisfaction only a well-executed performance can bring. In her hands she held a small, velvet box the color of dried blood, and as soon as I saw it, I knew what was about to happen. I didn't blink. I didn't look away. I just kept my wine glass steady and my mouth shut, even though my heart was hammering like I'd just run a mile uphill. She opened the box slowly, like it was some kind of reveal on a cooking show, and said, "This belonged to your grandmother. I think it's only right that it goes to someone who reminds me most of her. Ethan, sweetheart, come here." And that was it. The ring. The antique emerald one with the delicate scrollwork that had been passed down from eldest daughter to eldest daughter for 4 generations. The one my grandmother had promised to me on her deathbed. Her papery hand closing weakly over mine as she whispered, "It's yours, Rachel. Don't let anyone take it from you." That very same ring was now sliding onto my brother's undeserving, crooked finger, while the rest of the family clapped like seals high on white wine spritzers and smoked brisket. I didn't say a damn word. I smiled. A real, full-teeth smile, the kind I'd perfected over years of swallowing disappointment and setting the table while Ethan chased job after job, woman after woman, dream after dream, all of them ending in either a phone call for bail money or a mysterious GoFundMe page. I kept that smile in place as Mom kissed him on the cheek, like she hadn't just carved out the one piece of my inheritance I actually cared about and handed it to the golden child wrapped in a bow of maternal favoritism. Let me make something clear. This wasn't about the money. It never was. The ring wasn't worth that much in terms of dollars, though the emerald was real and the band was solid gold. What made it matter was everything it represented, the quiet dignity of my grandmother, who raised me more than my own mother did, the stories passed down, the late-night talks in her musty den while Lawrence Welk played in the background. It was supposed to be mine because she said it was, because she knew me, because I'd been there when it counted. And now, Mom had decided that none of that meant anything. As the applause faded, I took a sip of my wine, rosé, too sweet, but it did the job, and looked across the table at my father, who was staring at his plate like it might offer him an escape hatch. He'd always been a quiet man, not cold, but not someone who'd jump into conflict either. A veteran of 1 marriage, 2 kids, and 1,000 unspoken resentments. I leaned slightly to my right and said, "Dad, you have it, right?" I said it casually, like I was asking for a napkin or a refill, but the words stopped him cold. His fork paused midair. He blinked at me, then glanced sideways at my mother, who was now basking in the glow of Ethan's gratitude, totally unaware that the real gift hadn't been opened yet. Let me rewind a little. 2 years before this reunion, when Grandma was in hospice, I'd stayed with her for the last 4 weeks. Ethan had called once, drunk, of course, talking about a trip to Costa Rica he was planning, and how he'd swing by if he got the chance. He never did. I sat with Grandma through every slow, painful minute of her decline. I changed her sheets, fed her pureed carrots, read her the newspaper when her eyesight went, and listened when she told me things I knew she hadn't shared with anyone else. And on one of those nights, while the TV buzzed softly in the background, she made me go to her closet and retrieve a small, battered tin box. Inside was the ring. She held it in her fingers for a long moment before handing it to me, then placed a folded piece of paper on top. "This is just in case," she whispered. "You'll know what to do with it." I didn't tell anyone, not even my husband, who I'd been separated from by then, not even my teenage daughter, who asked me every few months if she'd get the ring someday. I just kept it hidden away, the ring, the letter, and something else I hadn't told anyone I had. Until now. My father swallowed hard and reached under the table. The moment his fingers closed around the manila envelope I'd given him earlier that day, I felt something in the air shift, like the temperature dropped a few degrees despite the Texas sun still blazing above us. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. My mother's smile began to falter. Just the tiniest bit. Ethan, meanwhile, was still grinning like he'd just won the lottery, completely oblivious to the trap door opening beneath his smug little feet. What came next wasn't an explosion. It was more like the first rumble of thunder when you're still deciding whether to stay outside or head in. But I knew what I was doing. I'd waited for this moment for 2 years. Not to prove I was right, not to shame them, but because Grandma had trusted me, and I wasn't about to let that trust be erased by one more family rewrite of who mattered and who didn't. The question wasn't whether I'd speak up. It was how loud the truth would echo when it finally landed. When people say siblings are just built different, I don't think they fully understand what it feels like to grow up in a house where the rules only seem to apply to one of you. From the outside, our family probably looked like something out of a slightly dysfunctional Hallmark movie. Dad working long hours at the county building, Mom chairing church committees like she was angling for sainthood, Ethan with his golden smile and natural charm, and me, Rachel, the firstborn, the responsible one, the girl who did her homework on time, and never forgot to send a thank you note. But under the surface, under the polite dinner conversations and Sunday service handshakes, there was a rot, small at first, like a hairline crack in concrete, but growing steadily with every year, every slight, every time someone laughed off Ethan's chaos and expected me to clean it up without complaint. I was 12 the first time Ethan got suspended. He was 10, full of attitude and smarter than most of the teachers who tried to discipline him, which meant he never took them seriously. He stole a hall pass, wandered off campus, and ended up at the corner store down the street, charming a clerk out of a pack of gum and 2 Snickers bars. When the school called home, I remember sitting at the kitchen table while Mom paced the floor, muttering about how boys will be boys, and he just needs more structure. When Dad got home, he grounded Ethan for the weekend. But by Saturday morning, they were tossing a football around in the yard like nothing had happened. Meanwhile, when I got a B+ in science 2 months later, I was grounded for 2 weeks with no phone and no TV. That's when I first started to notice the pattern. Ethan broke things. I was expected to fix them. Ethan lied. I was supposed to cover. Ethan drifted. I held the family down like an emotional anchor, trying not to sink under the weight of being the one who never got to stumble. But the thing is, it wasn't always resentment. That's the part people don't understand. I loved my brother. I really did. He could make me laugh harder than anyone, especially when we were kids. He could talk his way out of anything, sure. But he also knew how to light up a room, how to make even the most rigid of relatives loosen their shoulders and crack a smile. And when our grandmother started getting sick, Ethan did try to be there for about a week. He flew in, made a grand entrance, gave her a bouquet of flowers he probably bought from the gas station, sat at her bedside for 15 minutes, and then left because he had a business idea that he just couldn't pass up. I stayed. I stayed through the nights when Grandma would cry because she couldn't remember what day it was. I stayed through the weird, shameful little moments, like when I had to help her to the bathroom or feed her ice chips while she stared into the distance, half gone already. And during one of those nights, she told me about the ring again. Not just that it was mine, but why it was mine. She said her mother gave it to her the day after she lost her first child, a tiny girl who didn't make it past the first week of life. The ring was a reminder, she said, that life breaks, that hearts break, but something always survives. You hold on to the thing that lasts, she told me. You're that thing, Rachel, not Ethan, you. I didn't cry, not then. I nodded, I thanked her, I promised I would protect it, and I meant it. The day she died, I called Ethan and told him. He didn't answer. He sent a text 4 hours later that said, "Damn, I'll call tomorrow." He didn't. That was 2 years ago. 2 full years of me holding on to that promise, to that ring, to the envelope she left behind. 2 years of silent restraint while my mother gradually began shifting the family narrative, ever so subtly, until it sounded like Grandma had always wanted Ethan to have the ring. She adored Ethan, Mom would say at brunch, as if she hadn't spent half of Ethan's adult life bailing him out of either debt or heartbreak. She always said he reminded her of her late husband. That part may have been true. Grandpa had been a gambler with a charming grin, too, but Grandma knew better than to confuse nostalgia with trust. I started keeping notes, little things, phrases my mother would say, changes in the story she'd tell at family gatherings. I watched as she slowly erased me from the emotional center of the family's history. I watched her elevate Ethan, not maliciously, not with fire and brimstone, but with that same tight-lipped smile she used when telling someone they were so brave for wearing horizontal stripes. It was a calculated kindness, the kind that cuts deeper than outright cruelty. And then the ring came up again. It was during a casual dinner, just me, Mom, and Dad. Ethan had missed the dinner, again, but somehow the conversation drifted to Grandma and her things. Mom mentioned the ring, offhandedly, as if it were nothing special, and then said, "You know, I think she really wanted Ethan to have it. It's more his style." She said it with that same tone people use when explaining why they didn't invite you to something because they just assumed you'd be too busy. I didn't argue. I didn't even blink. I just nodded and cleared the dishes like I'd been doing since I was old enough to reach the sink. But that night, I found the envelope. I reread it. I read Grandma's handwriting, shaky but certain, and then I called a friend of mine who worked in probate. I asked what kind of documentation would hold up if there was ever a dispute. He gave me advice. I followed it, and I waited. When the family reunion came around and Mom insisted on hosting it at the lake house, I knew what was coming. She was going to make a show of it. Of Ethan, of everything. So I packed the envelope carefully in my carry-on. I made a copy just in case, and then I slipped the original into Dad's suitcase the night before the barbecue, while Mom was fussing with the grill and Ethan was off somewhere, probably charming the waitress at the boat rental dock. I didn't need to fight for the ring. I just needed the right moment to let the truth do the talking. The envelope itself wasn't anything special. Just a plain, old manila folder with a worn crease running diagonally across the flap, like it had spent too much time shoved between books and bills. But the weight of it, the sheer emotional density of what it held inside, made it feel like it was made of stone. I didn't open it often. In fact, after that first month following Grandma's funeral, I didn't open it at all until about 3 weeks before the reunion. I kept it buried in a box beneath a pile of old tax returns and expired passports, tucked in the back of my closet behind a pair of boots I hadn't worn since the divorce. Out of sight, yes, but never out of mind. Every so often, when my mother would bring up the ring or mention Ethan in that airy, proud tone of hers, I'd feel a low burn in the pit of my stomach. Not just anger, but something deeper. Something tangled up in grief and loyalty and years of being told to be the one who keeps the peace. It was always me who had to step back, bite my tongue, and let things slide. I wasn't raised to fight. I was raised to endure, and honestly, for most of my life, I thought that was the higher ground. But time has a way of sanding down your patience until what's left is just raw wood and exposed nerve. And when I reopened that envelope after nearly 2 years of keeping it sealed, I didn't feel guilt or shame. I felt ready. Inside were 2 things. The original handwritten letter from Grandma, dated and signed, where she clearly and explicitly stated that the ring was to go to me, and not just because I was her oldest granddaughter, but because I had been her true companion in the final stretch. That was how she put it. My true companion. The second item was a notarized declaration, one I helped her draft in her final weeks, though at the time she insisted on having her lawyer review it just to be safe. I didn't even push for that. She wanted to make sure her wishes were respected, and in hindsight, I think she already knew my mother would try to rewrite history the moment she was gone. The declaration was short, maybe a paragraph, but every word was measured and sharp. It named me as the intended recipient of the ring, the family's only remaining heirloom of real sentimental value. It specified the circumstances under which it was to be handed over and clearly stated that my mother had no authority to override or reassign that decision. It wasn't part of the will. Grandma had kept this separate on purpose, she said, because she knew how my mother handled things. That sentence lingered with me. I think it still does. I had everything I needed, legally and emotionally. But I wasn't interested in confrontation for the sake of theatrics. I didn't want a public takedown, a screaming match over a ring. That's the kind of drama Ethan would cause, not me. I wanted clarity, I wanted the truth to be undeniable, and maybe, just maybe, I wanted a moment where my mother had to look me in the eyes and acknowledge what she'd been pretending wasn't real. So when the family started organizing the reunion, I offered to help. Not because I was eager, but because I wanted to stay close to the planning, to know what was being said and done. As always, I took on the logistics, grocery runs, activity suggestions, spreadsheets for food allergies, and room assignments. Meanwhile, Mom handled the emotional tone, as she called it, which basically meant she got to decide who got to be honored, who got to make speeches, and who, unsurprisingly, would be gifted with the ceremonial treasure from Grandma's belongings. From the very beginning, it was obvious that she had her sights set on giving the ring to Ethan. She didn't say it out loud, not yet, but she dropped enough hints to make it clear. She talked about passing on family values, and how Ethan had really matured in the past year, and how some things just skip a generation and land on the right person. That last one nearly made me choke on my coffee. I didn't correct her, I didn't challenge her. I just smiled and asked if she wanted me to print name tags for the welcome dinner. That's the thing about being the one who never causes a scene. People assume you never will. They mistake silence for consent, restraint for weakness, and grace for ignorance. But I wasn't blind. I saw the whole damn play unfolding in slow motion, and instead of stopping it, I let her walk right into it. The night before we left for the lake house, I stayed up late packing. I laid out my daughter's swimsuit, triple-checked the Airbnb reservations for the cousins, and finally pulled the envelope from the back of my closet. I slid it into a new folder, clean and crisp, and tucked it into my carry-on, right next to my book and charger. But something told me that wouldn't be enough. I wanted a witness, someone neutral or close enough. So the morning of the barbecue, while Mom was out on the porch arranging citronella candles, and Ethan was charming my sister-in-law out of doing the dishes, I found Dad in his room folding towels. I handed him the folder and said, very simply, "You're going to need to hold this for me." He looked at me, puzzled. "What is it?" I said, "It's the truth. Just keep it close. I'll tell you when." He didn't ask anything else, which honestly surprised me. Maybe he was used to not being in the middle of things, or maybe a part of him knew it was time to stop pretending everything was fine. Either way, he nodded, placed the envelope gently into the bottom drawer of the nightstand, and gave me a long, searching look. I think it was the first time in years that he really saw me, not as the helper, not as the fixer, but as someone who had been caring more than anyone had realized. All day at the barbecue, I played my part. I laughed at the cousins' terrible jokes, passed out lemonade, complimented Mom on the food even though I knew the potato salad came from a store. I stayed cool when Ethan strutted around with that too white smile of his, and when Mom kept nudging me aside like I was blocking her spotlight. And when the time finally came, when she opened that velvet box in front of everyone and presented Ethan with the ring like it was a damn Oscar, I didn't even blink. Because I wasn't just holding onto a ring, I was holding onto the truth. And the truth has a way of landing harder when you let it speak for itself. By the time the barbecue hit full swing, the lake house was pulsing with the sort of chaotic energy that only happens when too many relatives are packed into one space, with too much booze and not enough history forgotten. Folding tables were sagging under the weight of baked beans, ribs, deviled eggs, and the world's most unnecessary 7-layer dip that Aunt Renee insisted on making every single year, even though half the family wouldn't touch it. Kids ran screaming through the backyard. Grown men stood around the grill, acting like war generals debating charcoal versus propane. And the women, those of us who knew better, rotated between small talk, refilling drinks, and quietly judging each other's potato salad. It was the kind of event where everything looks perfect on the surface, until someone scratches just deep enough to draw blood. I kept moving, kept smiling, kept playing my role. I took pictures with cousins I hadn't seen in 5 years, helped my niece get barbecue sauce out of her sundress, and made sure no one noticed the tension pulling at the edges of my mouth every time my mother's voice rose above the others. She was in rare form, floating from group to group like some benevolent queen bee, praising the turnout, bragging about the menu, and, without fail, tossing in some casual comment about how proud she was of Ethan for getting his life back together and really becoming the man of the family lately. Each time she said it, I caught someone's glance flicker over to me, awkward, uncertain. A few tried to overcompensate, throwing me a, "You must be so proud of your brother," or a, "You look great, Rachel, have you lost weight?" Like those thin compliments could patch up the insult tucked beneath her words. I let them all slide. I wasn't there to argue. I wasn't there to play referee between the image my mother was so desperate to sell and the reality everyone pretended not to notice. As the sun dipped lower and the drinks flowed faster, you could feel the momentum shifting. The volume of conversations rose. The laughter got louder. People started crowding toward the main patio where the ceremony, as Mom dramatically called it, was going to take place. It wasn't an official thing, of course, but she told everyone to gather so she could say a few words in Grandma's memory and pass down something meaningful. No one really knew what to expect, but by then they were all buzzed and full and willing to clap at anything that didn't require them to get up from their chairs. I sat near the back, close enough to hear every word, far enough to make an exit if things went sideways. My daughter, Katie, had wandered off with her cousins, and I could see Dad hovering just inside the sliding glass door, hands shoved into his pockets like he was trying to melt into the frame. He knew. He had the folder, and he was watching Mom the same way you might watch a magician you know is about to pull a trick with a rabbit that was never in the hat to begin with. Mom cleared her throat, God, that dramatic throat clearing, and raised her glass. The crowd quieted a bit. A few uncles leaned against the railing, plastic cups in hand, eyebrows arched like they were expecting her to announce a surprise engagement or a tax audit. She started talking about Grandma, weaving a syrupy story about legacy and tradition, about strength passed from woman to woman, generation to generation. And for a second, I almost believed her. For a second, it sounded like she actually remembered who Grandma was, like she had listened when she talked, like she hadn't spent the last few years undermining everything that woman stood for, just to maintain her grip on how this family looked from the outside. Then she reached into her handbag and pulled out the small, square, blood-red velvet box. The air shifted. Even the kids stopped yelling for a moment. She opened the box, slowly, theatrically, and turned to Ethan with that soft, rehearsed smile she always used on him. "This belonged to your grandmother," she said, voice suddenly thick with emotion that hadn't been there 10 seconds ago. "She wore it every Sunday and every holiday, and every time she wanted to feel close to her mother. And I think it's only right that it goes to someone who reminds me the most of her. Ethan, sweetheart, come here." He stepped forward like a golden retriever responding to a treat, all broad smiles and humble shrugs, and let her slide the ring onto his finger while the family applauded. Not politely, not hesitantly. They cheered like this was a coronation, like Ethan had just returned from battle, victorious and redeemed, the new keeper of the family's honor. And I sat there smiling. Not because I was happy, but because I knew something none of them knew yet. I knew the moment was a lie, and lies don't last when the truth has been sitting quietly in the next room, waiting to be invited in. I didn't jump up. I didn't yell. I didn't even raise my voice. I just set down my wine glass, stood up, and walked over to where Dad was standing inside the sliding door. His eyes met mine, steady and unsure all at once. "Do you still have it?" I asked. He nodded once, slowly, and reached behind him to the drawer where he had stashed the folder earlier that morning. He handed it to me without a word. The room was still half applauding, Ethan was still mugging for someone's Instagram story, and Mom had just begun another emotional monologue about legacy. When I stepped forward and placed the folder on the table in front of her, the applause died. "What's this?" she asked, her voice light but her eyes sharpening. I looked at her and I smiled again, not the one I'd been wearing all day, but a different kind of smile, quiet and deliberate. "You may want to read this out loud, Mom." And just like that, everything stopped. There's a strange kind of silence that happens when a room full of people realize they've been clapping for the wrong thing. It's not quiet, not really, not in the absence of sound sense, but more like a breath held just a second too long. Conversations stall in mid-sentence. Someone coughs too loudly, a fork scrapes across a paper plate like a scream in a horror movie, and all eyes slowly begin to shift. Some go to the person holding the folder, some go to the one it was handed to, but the ones that mattered most, at least to me in that moment, were locked on my mother's face as she opened the manila envelope and pulled out a folded sheet of cream-colored paper. For a split second, I thought she might not read it. I could see it in her eyes. The internal calculation, the frantic searching for a way to control the narrative without losing her grip. Her fingers trembled slightly, but not with fear. No, my mother didn't fear confrontation. She feared exposure. And this wasn't confrontation. This was her being handed a spotlight she hadn't asked for, a script she hadn't approved, and a stage that had just tilted in a direction she hadn't anticipated. She cleared her throat, but it didn't land with the same authority as before. This time, it was a reflex, a stalling mechanism. She opened the paper, stared at it for a few seconds longer than necessary, and then, without looking at anyone, began to read aloud. "To whom it may concern," she started, her voice steady but sharp at the edges. "This letter is to accompany the ring that has been passed down in our family for generations. As its current keeper, I wish to make my intentions clear." She paused just slightly, and I saw her jaw tighten. The crowd was frozen. Someone's phone buzzed against a wooden bench, and no one moved to silence it. Dad was standing near the doorway, his face pale, expression unreadable, and Ethan had stopped smiling entirely. His hand hung limply by his side, the ring glinting stupidly on his finger, like some cheap prop in a badly cast play. My mother continued, her voice a little thinner now. "This ring belongs to Rachel Ann Morris, my eldest granddaughter. She has been more than family to me. She has been my confidant, my caregiver, and the woman I believe most capable of honoring the legacy it carries. This is not a matter of tradition for tradition's sake, but a deliberate decision based on who I trust." There it was, that word, trust, sharp as a blade and impossible to miss. I saw heads turn back to me, then back to Ethan, who suddenly looked very much like a boy caught sneaking out the back door with someone else's jacket on. He tried to laugh. That easy, charming chuckle he'd leaned on since we were kids, but it caught in his throat this time. There was no applause now. No one cheered. No one smiled. And my mother, bless her, still tried to hold the floor. She finished the letter. "I hope this is respected not out of obligation, but because it is right. Sincerely, Margaret Louise Morris." Her hand shook now as she lowered the paper, and for the first time in my life, I watched her flounder. She looked around for someone to rescue her, but there was no lifeline. No cousin cracking a joke, no aunt changing the subject. Just a silence thick enough to choke on. I stepped forward and picked up the letter. I didn't say anything, not yet. I just held it for a moment, letting the words hang in the air like smoke. I looked at Ethan, who still hadn't said a word, and then at my mother, whose face had hardened into something unreadable, a mask of composure stretched over something uglier, something defensive and ancient and brittle. And then Ethan finally spoke. "You've got to be kidding me," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. His voice, usually smooth, cracked in the middle. She was half out of it by the time she wrote that. "You don't really believe she meant it." There it was, the shift, the thing I'd expected but still wasn't quite ready for. The moment where the golden child peeled back the layer of charm and revealed something far more familiar, entitlement. He didn't sound angry, not really. He sounded insulted, as if the idea that he wasn't the chosen one was somehow a personal attack. Like everything we'd grown up with, every favor, every pass, every time I was told to make room for him, wasn't enough, and now this one thing, this one goddamn thing that didn't land in his lap, was too much for him to swallow. I didn't answer him, not at first, because I could feel something bubbling in my chest. Not rage exactly, but a kind of tired grief. The kind that comes when you realize someone never saw you the way you thought they might eventually. I didn't want to fight with him. I didn't want to argue over whether Grandma was lucid or not. I knew what she said, I knew what she wrote, and I knew how she looked at me in those final weeks, with clarity, with certainty, with something like peace. But the crowd wasn't with me yet. Not fully. They were quiet, unsure, balancing on the edge of discomfort and doubt. And that's when Dad stepped forward. For the first time that entire day, he spoke up. "There's more," he said quietly, almost like he was surprised to hear his own voice. "There's another document." My mother turned to him so fast you'd think he slapped her. "What are you talking about?" she snapped, all veneer stripped from her voice now. He didn't flinch. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a smaller envelope. "She gave this to me, Margaret, a year before she passed. She said not to open it unless something like this happened." The energy in the air shifted again, this time deeper. A few people leaned forward, a few pulled back, and I felt a kind of numb electricity rise in my arms because I hadn't known about a second envelope. I thought I had it all. I thought I was the only one who knew. But now there was something else, something Grandma hadn't told even me. My father unfolded the paper slowly. He looked up at me once, then at my mother, then began to read. And just like that, brunch was over. When my father's voice broke through the stunned silence, I could feel the tension stretched tight enough to snap. He wasn't the type to intervene, let alone take a side. For most of my life, he had existed on the edge of conflict, always watching from the sidelines, occasionally sighing deeply, but rarely, if ever, stepping into the middle of the storm. But there he stood, holding that second envelope in his hands like it weighed more than the patio furniture everyone was gripping with white knuckles. His eyes were calm, but his posture was stiff, like he knew what he was about to say would leave a mark that couldn't be smoothed over with polite small talk or another plate of ribs. He unfolded the paper carefully, as if it might disintegrate from age or tension. He didn't rush. He read every word slowly, deliberately, like he wanted each syllable to land with maximum clarity. "This letter is written with the knowledge that when it is read, I will no longer be here to explain myself. But if this is being read, then the scenario I feared has come to pass." My mother's jaw clenched visibly. Her knuckles were white around the wine glass she hadn't touched in over 10 minutes, and Ethan had started shifting uncomfortably from foot to foot, the fake confidence unraveling thread by thread. My father continued, his voice taking on a surprising steadiness. "To my son-in-law and to my family gathered, I write this to confirm that I, Margaret Louise Morris, have named Rachel Ann Morris as my chosen successor for the family heirlooms and executor of my personal estate, as amended outside the formal will. This choice was not made lightly, and it is not open to debate. I understand this may be a disappointment to some, but it is my truth. Rachel was the one who stayed. She was the one who showed up. She is the one I trust." You could hear the sound of someone setting down a plate too hard in the background. A fork clattered to the deck. No one said anything for a full 10 seconds after he stopped reading. And in that time, I scanned every face in the circle, my mother frozen in her seat, lips pursed like she was sucking lemons, Ethan looking down at the ring on his finger like it had suddenly started burning. My aunt and cousins caught somewhere between shock and curiosity, none of them quite sure whether to act outraged or relieved that the drama wasn't aimed at them. Then Ethan spoke. "She didn't mean it," he said again, but this time his voice was smaller. "She was old. She probably didn't even know what she was signing." He wasn't looking at me anymore. He was looking at Dad, almost like he was asking for a way out, a reason to dismiss what had just happened. "I mean, she was what, 86? She could barely finish sentences by the end." I felt something twist in my gut. Not rage, not yet, but that deeper, older wound that comes when someone you love pretends that showing up doesn't matter. I didn't move. I didn't interrupt. I let him speak, let him expose himself. I wanted everyone to hear it. Unfiltered, the entitlement unmasked. That's when Aunt Renee finally chimed in, her voice shaky but loud enough to carry. I saw Margaret that last month, she said, her fork forgotten on her lap. I brought her groceries twice. She was tired, sure, but she was sharp. She told me, word for word, that she wanted Rachel to have the ring and that she didn't trust your mother to make it happen. I didn't think she meant it so literally, but she said it plain as day. That did it. You could feel the tide begin to turn, not in a dramatic, cinematic way, but in a slow, grinding shift like tectonic plates moving under everyone's feet. People began murmuring softly at first. Little things like, I remember her saying something similar, or she always talked about Rachel being her rock. The whisper network of extended family began recalibrating their loyalties in real time, doing the quiet math in their heads about who had really been there, who had earned what, and who had just been coasting on charm and convenience. My mother stood abruptly, her chair scraping loudly across the deck. "This is not the time or the place for this kind of spectacle," she snapped, her voice cutting through the murmurs like glass through silk. "We came here to celebrate family, not to air out private matters like a damn reality show." I looked at her, and this time, I didn't try to mask anything. I let the exhaustion, the betrayal, the quiet fury show on my face. "You made it public the moment you handed that ring to Ethan like it was yours to give," I said, my voice low but firm. "You knew what Grandma wanted. You knew, you just didn't care." She opened her mouth to argue, but then Dad, sweet passive Dad, who had spent most of his life avoiding conflict, cut in before she could launch. "I knew about the letter," he said, his voice gravel now. "Margaret gave it to me herself, and I knew she meant it. I just didn't think you'd go this far, Laura." And just like that, the final piece clicked into place. The last defense, the last smokescreen, vanished. My mother sat back down slowly, looking not furious anymore, but stunned. Like she'd finally realized that the house of cards she'd been building out of control, appearances, and selective memory had collapsed all at once, and there was no salvaging the structure. But Ethan wasn't done. He took off the ring, finally, and tossed it onto the table, where it spun briefly before coming to a slow, rattling stop. "You know what? Take it," he said, not to me, but to the whole group. Like he was above it now, like the ring had always been a burden, rather than a prize he'd been clutching like a toddler with candy 5 minutes ago. "It's just a ring, it doesn't prove anything." I looked at the ring. I didn't pick it up, not yet. I just looked at it, that simple gold band with the single green emerald that had started all this. And in that moment, I didn't feel victorious. I felt hollow, because the truth was, this wasn't just about the ring. It was about everything the ring had come to represent. Decades of imbalance, the rewriting of memory, the constant erosion of my place in this family by a mother who couldn't see me unless I was holding everyone else together without asking for anything in return. I looked at my father, who gave me the smallest, most solemn nod, and then I looked at the others, at my cousins, my aunts, even Ethan, who was already pulling out his phone and scrolling like he needed to escape into another world. And I realized something that hit harder than all of it. There was one more truth left to tell, and I was the only one who knew it. The ring didn't move for a long time after Ethan tossed it onto the table, and nobody reached for it. Not even the cousins who always found a way to involve themselves in everything. It just sat there, glinting in the late afternoon sun, the emerald catching light as if it were alive, quietly daring someone to pick it up and claim it, like it knew it had become something more than jewelry. I could feel the air thickening, the hum of awkwardness growing louder than any music or laughter that had come before. And the strange part was that I didn't feel vindicated in the way I thought I would. I had imagined this moment countless times over the last 2 years, had rehearsed what I'd say if the truth ever got the chance to walk into the room with its shoulders back and its chin high. But now that it had arrived, it felt like I had kicked open a door only to find a room I didn't recognize, filled with the wreckage of people's illusions that had just been torn down. I walked slowly to the table and picked up the ring, not because I wanted to win, not because I needed to make a show of it, but because I couldn't stand the sight of it sitting there like a symbol of everything broken and unresolved. The weight of it in my hand was both heavier and smaller than I remembered. Real gold always has that kind of density, like the past itself is pressing down on your palm. I turned it over a few times, tracing the edges of the setting with my thumb, and then looked around the patio where half the family stood frozen in some combination of discomfort, pity, and fear that someone else was about to say something true and ruin whatever piece they were still clinging to. I didn't make a speech. I didn't need to. What needed saying had already been said. But as I turned toward the steps that led back inside, I felt my mother's eyes on me, not soft or regretful, not angry even, but calculating. There was something cold and evaluative in her expression, the kind of look she used to give me when I brought home straight A's but didn't get chosen for student council. That quiet judgment that said I had succeeded, but not in the way she found valuable. She hadn't spoken a word since my father had read the second letter, and I realized, as I stood there with the ring in my hand, that she probably never would. Her silence wasn't an apology. It wasn't even shame. It was strategy. Later that night, after the guests had begun drifting back to their cars, and the cousins had retreated inside to scroll on their phones or sneak a beer from the cooler, I found myself in the kitchen, alone with my father. The air still smelled like smoke and burnt sugar, and the deck outside was scattered with paper plates and half-empty cups no one had bothered to throw away. He was standing at the sink, rinsing off serving spoons like the normalcy of dishes could somehow anchor him to the present. I leaned against the counter, the ring still in my pocket, and asked him the question I'd been holding on to since the second envelope came out. "When did you know?" I said it quietly, but there was no hesitation in my voice. "When did you realize she'd never give it to me?" He didn't look at me right away. He rinsed another spoon, set it in the drying rack, and then finally turned to face me with a tiredness in his eyes I hadn't noticed before. "I think I always knew," he said, voice low and even. "But I didn't want to see it, not really. Your mom, she's never been good at giving up control, and she didn't like how close you and Margaret were. She thought it was disloyal. She thought your loyalty should have been to her, not your grandmother." I let the words settle for a moment. They weren't a surprise, not exactly. I had suspected as much for years, but hearing them spoken aloud added a strange new weight to the past, like finding the missing piece of a puzzle only to realize the image it completed wasn't what you hoped it would be. "I wasn't disloyal," I said, and he nodded. "I know, Margaret knew too. That's why she gave you what she did." I looked out the window at the yard, at the string lights swaying gently in the wind, at the place where my brother had stood earlier, like a man receiving a crown he hadn't earned. And I thought about the years I had spent holding my tongue, swallowing my hurt, performing gratitude for a family that only ever really appreciated me when I was making their lives easier. I didn't regret staying with Grandma in her final days. I didn't regret doing the work, or being the one she could lean on, even if no one else acknowledged it. But I did feel something deeper than regret, something that had been waiting to surface for a long time. I felt done, not with the family entirely, not in the dramatic "I'll never see you again" kind of way, but with the version of myself that had been trained to play nice while being erased in slow motion. I had kept the peace for years, had smiled through subtle insults, had helped clean up messes I hadn't made, and I had done it all without ever asking for recognition. But now I understood something I hadn't allowed myself to admit before. Peace without truth isn't peace. It's just silence dressed in manners. My father walked out of the room eventually, leaving me alone in the kitchen with the sound of the refrigerator humming and the quiet ticking of the wall clock that had hung there since I was a teenager. I reached into my pocket, pulled out the ring, and looked at it one last time before slipping it onto my finger. It fit. Of course it did. It had always been meant for me, but it didn't feel like a prize. It felt like a responsibility, like the weight of legacy mixed with the ache of memory, and I didn't know what I would do with it yet. I only knew I wouldn't give it back. As I turned off the kitchen light and made my way to bed, I passed the hallway where my mother's door was still cracked open, the faint glow of a lamp spilling onto the floor. I didn't stop. I didn't say goodnight. I just kept walking. Some things don't need to be confronted twice. Some truths only need to be said once to echo forever. And the funny part is, I know people will talk about what happened that day for years. They'll whisper about the reunion where the whole family got split down the middle, where old wounds were pulled into the light, and where a ring started a war that had been waiting to happen for decades. Some will say I did the right thing. Some will call it selfish, dramatic, unnecessary. Let them. I didn't do it for them. I did it for the woman who looked at me in her final days and said, "Don't let anyone take this from you." I did it for the girl I used to be, the one who cleaned up after her brother and stayed quiet so her mother wouldn't explode. I did it for the truth. And maybe that's not a perfect ending. Maybe there are no perfect endings in families like mine. But there is something honest about it, something real. And sometimes, real is enough. The truth doesn't always bring closure. Sometimes, it just brings clarity. And clarity, that's where the real story begins.